Have you ever found yourself in situations where in one instance you're popping off, you're hitting your shots, and you feel like you're in your zone, and then in one other instance you somehow just can't seem to find your footing and you're all over the place? Well, that's likely because you still have a hard time finding out what your actual playstyle is. And so knowing what a playstyle is versus understanding what your own playstyle is are two different things. So in this video, we're going to cover those and much more. So if you want to see more educational content for Destiny 2, if you enjoy sci-fi content and want to be a part of a great, positive, uplifting community, then be sure as always to like, comment, and subscribe. And let's get straight into the video. In most respective competitive games, going all the way back to the days of Quake and Counter-Strike 1.6, games of which I've played countless times as a kid growing up in the 90s, all of these games tend to have playstyles, and those playstyles will typically indicate whether or not you as a player are good in one area or, let's say, not so good in that area. But that can also give you a strong indication of how to deal with other players of that varying playstyle. So first, before we get into how to find your playstyle, let's first understand and know what each playstyle is. So the first one is your aggressor. This is the person who would typically be the one who loves that close range combat, somebody who would typically use guns like a shotgun or an SMG, guns that can eliminate targets very quickly, allowing that person to go around the map and just deal with targets effectively with very little to think about. So that would normally be like your run and gun playstyle in other games, or let's say in a fighting game, that would be like the rush down player. This is somebody who just wants to, again, constantly apply pressure and therefore be in your face at all times. In Destiny 2, you'd consider that to be the alpha player. The alpha player is like the aggressor. Then you have what's known as the more well-rounded player, or the play style. And that play style typically comes in the form of you're able to adapt to varying degrees of scenarios. So you are able to take whatever gun or whatever weapon you desire, and you can maximize it in whichever way. But the caveat is that you're not necessarily amazing or cracked in one particular area. You're either just really good with long range, or you're good with mid range, or you're good with close range, but you're not necessarily proficient in any one of those categories. And that would be something like a Soldier 76 in Overwatch, or a Ryu in Street Fighter. Just a character that kind of gives you the full spectrum, but not necessarily amazing in one area. So then you have what would be known as the Gamma. And now in that particular point, that would be a beta character, by the way, in Destiny 2. Now, a Gamma is someone who prefers to be at a mid-range. So normally you would have someone who plays more of that in between, not necessarily beta, but not necessarily omega, but you'd have someone who would be mid-range, who loves to use something like ARs, pulse rifles, someone who wants to maintain that space, but not too far away to where they can't apply pressure when necessary. So that would be, let's say, a character in Street Fighter where you'd have someone like Rose, or let's say in this game, you have your pulse rifles, you have your ARs, maybe you have your hand cannons. Those are typically guns that you want to be using in a mid-range to keep the player away, but not too far enough to where you can apply pressure. And so then you have what's known as the Omega. And this Omega playstyle is typically a player who prefers to be long range, the keep away game, the more defensive, if you will. And this category is where I would typically fall into, and we'll get into that very soon. But typically Omega players want to be playing with things like snipers, ARs, scout rifles. These are the guns that they specialize in because they are the ones who want to be peeking, popping off from a long range, supporting their team from behind, and therefore not allowing the aggressors or the rush down players to get in your face. And so that would be something like Dalsim from Street Fighter, for example. So this in itself is what encapsulates different playstyles. And in Destiny 2, they play integral roles, because depending on the situation, you're going to want to have an Omega player, you're going to want to have the aggressor or the alpha player, or you're going to want to have someone who's well-rounded like the beta player. So knowing this playstyle, knowing what these playstyles represent, are first integral to knowing and understanding who you are as a player before jumping into them. So that being said, let's move into the actual details. In the world of competitive games, your stats matter. It's why you have your kills and your deaths, your KD ratio. All of these numbers represent your performance, and as a result, that gives you a greater perspective of your overall playstyle within the realm of that game. So in the case of Destiny 2, whether you're playing PvE or PvP, having the data in front of you will give you a greater idea and insight as to what your playstyle actually is. Because from time to time you'll play the game and you won't realize that you're performing really well in this area or you're really bad in this area because you're so caught up in the gameplay. So I highly suggest that if you are looking to find your playstyle and really solidify yourself, make a spreadsheet. And on screen I'll show you what I've been doing recently, where every month I tally my results based on the weapons that I tend to use. And these results will give me a greater idea as to what my overall playstyle is. So in this case, for the beginning of the month of March, I've determined that my playstyle is more in line with Gamma/Omega, where I tend to play more of that mid to long range. And depending on the map or the circumstance, I'll swap between those as needed. But more or less, the numbers have given me greater insight as to how I perform, because ultimately, at the end of the day, any competitive game is psychological. It's a combination of logic and emotion. And so typically, if you're on the more cerebral side, the more defensive side, like myself, you'll tend to be more leaning towards the Gamma/Omega. Whereas perhaps you're more, I don't want to say impatient, but let's say you want to be the more decisive player. You're in there, you're making that impulse decision. That would probably put you in the more aggro/alpha category. But again, this will all come to fruition once you have the numbers on screen to give you that data. So that being said, I highly recommend that if you are a new player, or if you're just a veteran player looking just to kind of refine your playstyle in some way, then I highly suggest making a spreadsheet, thus giving you a visual indicator of what your actual playstyle is, versus just randomly jumping into a game and swapping off different weapons, and it just creates all this discomfort between you and your players or your teammates. So let's move on to the next point. So this point goes back to the previous point of making a spreadsheet and getting a good glimpse as to your statistics and performance pertaining to your preferred weapons. And so that will give you a good indicator of where your direction is headed in for your playstyle. But at the same time, it's good to explore and experiment with different options. So in my case, because I do love to play a more mid to long range game, I tried to experiment with SMGs and shotguns to see if I can perhaps find a healthy medium. But ultimately, those guns just did not feel well to me. They didn't really give me the best performance. And so I said, you know what? The game is telling me that my performance is better in a more mid to long range, so I'll master those weapons. And so the same can be said for you. And this point is important because I want to really stress that a meta is something that is subjective. A meta is something that is an opinion at the end of the day, and an opinion can change. And so looking at the meta as a means to determine how you should play the game is the wrong way to approach your playstyle, because a meta can shift from time to time, whether it's one big patch or a small change to a weapon. A meta can shift, but your playstyle is typically very rooted in the core of your being. So with all that being said, a meta should just be used as a metric, something to give you some inspiration to say, okay, so I know what's strong out there, but does that play to my playstyle? Maybe not. And the problem with a lot of players that I tend to watch and just observe is that they're too heavily dependent on the meta and what the meta defines, you know, the whole scope of things. And that can ultimately ruin your playstyle and your flow because you're playing against the rhythm of your own playstyle. So in the end, play what you love, experiment, but if what you experimented with doesn't work, then it's important to go back to what's proficient and continue to refine and master, because that's what's gonna help you become even better as a player. And therefore, when you're on a team, it's easier for your teammates to basically delegate tasks effectively, because they know, okay, so New is more of a Omega / Gamma player, so let's have him be in the back taking out the larger targets with a sniper or a combat bow. Or so and so is more aggro, let's have them rush in, do some power hits, and then we'll have someone else come in to clean up. Just thinking about those things in the back of your mind are really important. So don't try to get yourself caught up in the meta, because all that can shift. But stay rooted, stay grounded in what you are fundamentally strong with, and by using your stat charts, that will give you the best indication moving forward. So that being said, let's move on to the last point. The last point I wanted to touch on was engaging thought. And this is your logic and emotional balance. And the reason why this is important when it comes to finding your playstyle is because at the end of the day, as I mentioned earlier in the video, that most competitive games come down to psychologic performance. It comes down to how you like to think, but also how you like to act. So your emotions also do play a role in your playstyle. So how does this correlate to finding the playstyle? Well, again, in my case, as an example, the reason why I do typically like to play more keep away, a more defensive playstyle, is my personality kind of reflects that. I'm more of a methodical, a more calculating, more cerebral person in real life. I tend to be more calm, laid back, pretty patient with how I like to do things. And so that personality trait, or that psychological trait, those emotional traits, tend to fare better for me. Versus when if I'm in a situation where, let's say, I have to play the aggressor, it goes against that more calm and more composed nature, because now I'm having to kind of be more of that, you know, aggressor. I got to be in your face, where that's not where I typically feel the most impactful. So knowing where you stand as far as your personality traits as well, your logic and your emotional balance is concerned, that can also be of great contribution to knowing and finding and understanding your playstyle long term. So as you play the game of Destiny 2 and you're playing with your friends and you come across patterns of behavior, that is, let's say you're playing with your fire team and you always have your friends telling you, hey, so-and-so, I want you to play this role. And it seems to happen every week that you're playing a raid, you're playing a dungeon, or you're playing PvP, and your friends are always like, okay, all right, I want you to go play sniper. And in your mind, you're like, how did you know? Like, how did you know that this is my style? Because other people can observe and they can really notice how you play as a person. So it's good to know yourself, right? Know yourself first, because then it becomes easier to know others. So in the end, just take your time, maybe take some mental notes, even writing down some actual notes as to your personality, and think to yourself, okay, so how does this match and correlate to my play style? And once you start to kind of connect the dots, you'll start to see, oh, okay, so that's why I like to play more aggro. Oh, okay, that's why I like to play more mid-range. Oh, okay, that's why I like to play more long range. Your personality really does shine a lot in your play style, and so it really does give you a really deep glimpse into that. So study the psychology of the game, study the emotional aspect of the game, and you'll soon see just how fun the game can be when you match things together. So hopefully this video has given you some insight and it has been educational in some way. I know it's been quite long, but I do like these videos because I do prefer to be more on the educational side of Destiny 2, more so than the, you know, pop-offs and the hype reels. So if you enjoyed content like this, once again, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, new warriors, stay strong, keep fighting, and may the force be with you all always. See you next time. Have a good one, and join the Discord community if you want to be a part of a positive and uplifting one. Alrighty, take care. Peace.